Welcome back to a bit gamey and another history video, this one on floristic regions. Well, floristic regions, they're they're climate they're climate regions really, but where the climate determines the sort of plants that grow in a particular place and the sort of animals that feed off those plants. So it's like a specific slant on climate regions. It's a bit esoteric, but whatever, I find it interesting. The main gist is that various cultures and empires and tribal expansions, etc., tend to follow these floristic zones because, like, once the people have learned how to live in a particular area, if that area kind of expands over time due to climate change, then they'll expand into that new territory as well. So it's really it's an explanation for why some of the Neolithic cultures expanded where they did and didn't expand where they didn't, and then later on a possible explanation for the Celtic expansion, the Germanic expansion, and the Slavic expansion, and why they happened in that order rather than all at once. So I think this is the intro for that, and it's going to be 3 chunks. It's going to be one on the actual history, one on why I think why and how it affected European mythology, and the third one is third part is going to be on how you can introduce something like this into a war games campaign as the kind of basis of it, and possibly after that various addendums of things I've forgotten. Okie doke. So this is part 1 on the history behind it all and how it started. How it started was, I was reading up on the Neolithic expansion into Europe, and the later stages when it was like gradually moving up into northern Europe and stuff. And you see all these maps of this culture called the LBK culture, which is, it doesn't matter, it's just a northern version of the early Neolithic farmers. And all the maps had this little gap around the coast, so going up towards the Atlantic, which didn't make any sense to me at the time. And there's lots of maps like this in all the different books and magazine articles and the rest of it. For example, there's another one from some other book or magazine or whatever it was. We say there's this constant recurring theme of the Atlantic region. There being a gap between how far the farmers spread and the Atlantic coast regions of Europe, which just struck me as really odd at the time. I noticed it, but had no idea what the cause might be. And then much later, I saw this, or came across this image of the modern day floristic regions in Europe. And the thing that struck me, of course, was this the Atlantic region as kind of separate from Central European. So this is a modern map. It's like what it is like now, and it's not necessarily what it was like in the past. But that sort of first gave me the clue that that gap that was on those LBK maps may be something to do with the difference between these two climate zones, or 2 floristic regions. And the other thing that I noticed at the time was the Mediterranean being basically all one region. That the climate, because the climate in that Mediterranean region was mainly in common. So after a bit of research on the Atlantic coastal region, I got that the problem there is the very heavy rainfall, because obviously you need a lot of rain for farming, but along the Atlantic coast you got too much, and what it did was basically it leached the soil too much, And so the very early farming, like in the Neolithic, it was quite hard. It was difficult to grow crops, difficult to grow wheat, basically, which was the thing at the time in Central Europe. So so that was that explained to me the kind of mystery of why the LBK culture was had the shape it did, with this gap along the Atlantic coast. That made me wonder about what more there might be, or where else it might lead. So I thought I'd start from the beginning, and looking at how climate changed over that time. Because we are still coming out of, or were coming out of the Ice Age. And so I was looking at this. You can see that. According to this, the climate was like this in the 12,000 years ago, then 10,000, then 6,000, then 2,000. So basically, it's got warmer. This is what you'd expect, really. If you're coming out of an ice age, it's going to get warmer. But it didn't get warmer everywhere at once. It started off, around on the edges of the Mediterranean, then gradually, moved up a bit to like Central Europe-ish, or not even Central, really, more like Southern Europe. And then it got up to Central and then Northern Europe, sort of 6,000 years ago, and then a little bit more since then. So that's kind of that's kind of the key factor, is that it's got warmer, and it got warmer from the south to the north, which is what you'd expect. And the first stage then is as it gets warmer, you get all the hunter-gatherers gradually spreading around the terrain, doing hunter-gatherer things. And after a little bit longer, you start getting to the point where it's warm enough for crops. And the thing about crops is you need land, you need fertile land, you need water, and you need a suitable crop, which in the case of the Western Eurasian is wheat. And wheat started off around in southern Mesopotamia, in Sumer, which also had these nice big rivers to provide the irrigation for it. So you start off with farming in southern Mesopotamia, and then it spreads north into northern Mesopotamia, along the eastern Med coast and down into Egypt. So that's where the story starts. But then I was wondering, how did it get from there, with farming just in northern Mesopotamia, and how do we get from there to here? This is like, say, the modern version of the Floristic regions in Europe. So if we combine this image of it getting gradually warmer from the south, and still in the ice age further north, and assume there's some kind of transitional period transitional zone in between, getting warmer in the south and cold still in the north, and we combine that with this modern version of the climate zones, but you'd imagine that northern region called Boreal was pushed much lower, so it was like coming right down into Central Europe, and that's a kind of like sets, or it's kind of semi kind of steppe sort of region, or semi kind of what's the word for it, taiga Taiga region, which is like particularly cold. So you've got your Mediterranean region in the south, and a much thinner band of transition region in between. So this is where my graphical skills start to break down. So from that original picture where the Boreal was up in the north and got central and whatever much bigger in this in Central Europe. So I'm saying at the beginning it was you got the Mediterranean zone, and then a much thinner central zone with all that northern Europe and down towards the centre being still Boreal. So you can see that because the Mediterranean zone is roughly at the similar kind of latitudes, and because it goes east to west, you can see that that the farming can spread very rapidly east to west until you covers all the islands and lots of little colony settlements along the coast, both of north and southern edges of the Mediterranean. So I think that's basically what happened. The first European stage is these colonies all around the edges of the Mediterranean and in the islands, and then there's a transitional phase of labels 4, which is where the people who are in those kind of coastal colonies spread out as trappers, hunters, and particularly mining. Going forward into little colonies that aren't sort of really self-sustaining exactly, but they're producing ore, mainly sort of, copper or whatever, and trading for food with the places further south. And then eventually you get the people in the southeast Europe develop crops that could work in the new climate, and they started to expand into the main part of Europe from there, down the various rivers, the Danube and the Rhine, and that kind of orangey bit there in the north, that's like the LBK culture. These are the early European farmers coming up from the south, some of the southeast, who spread over Europe in that time, and that to my mind explains the gap in the map for the LBK. So it's not important at all, but it's interesting to me why that gap existed. And then there's a jump from this, because after the early farmers had got to this point, as somewhere along the lines, I think it's around 4,000 years ago, I think, or 6,000, I forget, something like that. You had the Indo-Europeans with the horses and the chariots kind of moved in. And I think there'd been an earlier kind of wave as well, to do with copper mining that had come along there. But the general gist is that eventually the Indo-Europeans took over, beat up the early farmers, and that leads into the next point, which is the various expansions after the Indo-Europeans had arrived. After the Indo-Europeans arrived, there was the Celtic expansion, then the Germanic expansion, and then the Slavic expansion. And so I think they're all kind of they'll have the same but different reasons why they happened, and the kind of geographical shape that they took on. So although the population changed in that region sort of during this period, with the Indo-Europeans taking over from the early farmers in that central region, I think the general pattern would have been the same. So, it's got warmer, so the boreal region had kind of shrunk further to the north. The central region had expanded a bit more, and that now had become, the Celtic land rather than the early farmer land. But that kind of explains in my opinion, explains the general shape of the Celtic expansion. So when you look at what is called the Celtic expansion, you can see it's mostly this kind of rectangular block just north of the Mediterranean. I mean, there is a bit more to it as well. There's like the extension into the British Isles, which is because it's a bit warmer along the Atlantic coast because of the Gulf Stream, and if they what's called the Celtic expansion, I think it was just the last Celtic expansion. I think they'd expanded before. Particularly, they expanded, I think, from the west. They'd come from the east, from the Ukraine region, spread into this central band. But then, because the Atlantic coast region was the most suitable for cattle herding because of the rain, they expanded from there first. So they came from the east to the west, and then expanded from the west. I think there's a big theory about that called Celtic from the west, which is I think it's half true. I think they came from the east first, and then they kind of boomeranged back. But then the last expansion was centered around Switzerland and areas and places like that, mainly because of iron, and then he kind of went back west and east from that central point. But the general gist is this kind of almost rectangular expansion in that region of territory that's just above the Mediterranean, which ended up crashing through the Alps and into northern Italy and into Spain, and latterly into across into Turkey with the Galatians. But yes, so that's my main point. So I think the Celtic expansion was the point where the people that were already Celtic, with a relatively low population density, it got warm enough for them to start growing more food, and so the population expanded, and as the population expanded, they pushed out from the inner core. But the shape of it is because the north was still boreal. North of that point, it's still kind of too cold for proper farming, and below that point, the population's already kind of got too big. So that's the my explanation for the Celtic expansion. It got warm enough in that region for the population to expand, and then they pushed out east, west, south, etc., etc. So the next stage, I think, was a bit like this. It got warmer again. It had got warmer in the centre, so you get the Celtic expansion around that central zone, and then it carries on getting warmer, but it's more west to east. It's like originally this boreal zone had been cold and wet in the west, and cold and dry in the east, and then after the it gradually got warmer. It got warmer in the west first, or rather, the northwest region. So it went from cold and wet to warm and wet, or warmer and wet. Well, it's still cold and wet, cold and dry in the eastern region, northeastern region. So the idea is that this region was originally cold and wet, and it's gradually became warmer and wet. It's not really warm, but warm enough for farming. Or improved farming, basically, because they had farming already. It was just mostly herding and stuff. But as it got warmer, you produce more food, and as you produce more food, you get more people, and they start pushing out of the original area because there's too many of them. So as it says, it's identical to the Celtic expansion, except it happened later because it took longer for it to get warm enough for the population to expand. So that's the second or third of these. The LBK was the first, Celtic expansion was the second, and this is the third, the Germanic expansion. And the fourth example, or third, depending on your point of view, is the Slavic expansion. Basically taking the original idea that it got warm enough in the northwest. It went from cold and wet to warmish and wet, whereas the further east it was cold and dry. But eventually it got warm enough for the northeastern region to start farming as well. It was on the original Floristic region map. It's called the Russian steppe, I think. That was a check. Yeah, Central Russian. I'd say on the modern map you can see there's this division between what they call the Central European region and the Central Russian region. I suppose really northwest versus, well, not really northwest. It's west versus east really. It's kind of drier and colder in that part. So first of all, the Central European region was down there, and it was the centre of the Celtic expansion, and then it extended. That Central European zone extended northwards to include Scandinavia, and that became the root of the Germanic expansion. And then later on, because originally this was still too cold, and too cold and too dry, and the population there was living in like in the marshes and such, protect marshes. Not not exactly hunter gatherers, but very low level farming because of the climate. But yeah, so after you first had the Celtic expansion, then hundreds of years later you get the Germanic expansion, and then hundreds of years later you get the Slavic expansion, as that Central Russian region basically comes into being. So this is a kind of a map of the Slavic expansion. Assuming they started off mostly centered in the Pripyat marshes region. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems feasible, because when it's kind of too cold for farming, then marshlands with lots of fish and such is another option. Originally, before the expansion started, during the Ice Age, the refuges were in marshy regions, because you could survive then because of the fish being cold-blooded. But anyway, blah blah blah. So they're saying around 700 AD, it got warm enough for them to start for a more advanced farming to take place. Wherever the Slavs started off, and they kind of gradually moved out from that point. Again, so exactly the same as the Celtic expansion. It got warm enough, the population expanded, so they pushed out. Then later it got warm enough for improved farming in the northwest, and so they pushed out as the Germanic expansion. And then lastly, it got warm enough for advanced or improved farming in the Slavic regions, and then the Slavic expansion happened, and they pushed all the way down into the Balkans and the Eastern Med and East, whatever, all over the place. So that's the the general thing of the history. It's just, it's not particularly important. I think it's just interesting to me that people follow the climate of as regions become better able to produce more people, then those people expand. And so in the Celtic, Germanic and Slavic expansions were all driven by the same thing, just at different times. And the earliest case, the LBK case, is more the opposite, in that they expanded up. There was a barrier. The Atlantic coast was a barrier initially. It became less so later, because the crops improved, but it was a barrier in that early Neolithic phase. So anyway, that's the history part of this, part one. I don't know if it's of any interest to anyone, but it's interesting to me, so I did it. So I think that's how the modern floristic regions came into being. It starts off, the Boreal region, or Arctic region, is comes down much further south, and you've got this kind of squashed central region above the Mediterranean, and then next stage, the central region, it gets warmer. Boreal region gets pushed back. Central region gets bigger, and that's the basis for the Celtic expansion. Then it's getting warmer from the south, but the two factors are, it's getting warmer from the south, but also it's slightly warmer along the Atlantic edge, partly for the Gulf Stream further down, and partly just because it's the kind of continental in the interior, it just gets particularly cold in the winter, whereas the ocean kind of keeps it slightly warmer. So anyway, the third stage is the central region has expanded, and then the northwest region gets added to the central region, and that's the basis of the Germanic expansion. And then lastly, you get the Boreal gets pushed back a little bit further, and then the kind of the central Russian region develops. Still cold and dry, but just enough to get agriculture improved enough to generate a big expansion, and that's how you end up with the modern version of the regions. With the boreal region pushed right back, this central dividing into two, Central European and Central Russian, basically warm and wet versus cold and wet. No, sorry, warm and wet versus cold and dry. Or warm, dry. I forget. I've lost the plot now. But anyway, that's I say the gradual warming after the ice age, taking place in different regions at different times. Starting in Mesopotamia, moving to the Mediterranean, then into Central Europe, and then northwestern Europe, then the East, and to get to the modern pattern that we have today. And how that, I think basically that's what drives a lot of ancient history, is that process of the Earth gradually warming up from the equator, and how the combination of that with the oceans sort of creates a sequence of viable farming, and then the population expands based on when it becomes viable for improved farming. Okay, look, that's the end of that. Okay, so that was part 1.